The Ghost Rider effect is like the definition of awesome. It's a flaming skeleton riding a motorcycle. You do not get cooler than that. And you can actually make it for free using just Davinci Resolve. Now heads up, this is a fairly advanced effect, so if you're new to Fusion, hop on your flaming motorcycle and ride on over to my beginner playlist before trying this one. So here in Fusion, I have this shot of a guy riding a motorcycle that I found for free on pexels.com, and I thought it would look pretty well for this effect. So our guy's head is moving around a bit, so I'm going to add a tracker node and bring that over to his helmet. I'm gonna get somewhere with good contrast. Then I'm gonna change the adaptive mode to best match and bring down the match tolerance a little bit. Now I also want to track the rotation and scale of his helmet, so I'm gonna add another tracker and bring that to another part of his helmet. That looks good. And then I'm just gonna track those forward. All right, that finished tracking. Now since we're gonna be adding a bunch of stuff that's all gonna follow this head movement, I'm gonna do something a little bit interesting. So I could copy this tracker and add it to each individual thing I add, but that's not really efficient. So instead, I'm gonna go under the operation and change it to match move. Then I'm gonna set the merge to BG only. So now our head is stabilized. So to get our motion back, I'm gonna copy this tracker, paste it over here. Then I'm going to take the output of this tracker and plug it into the foreground. Then under the operation, I'm going to change the merge to foreground over background. So now we have the exact same motion that we started out with. Now there is some weird stuff going on with the edges, but that's easy enough to crop out at the end. Now I can make sure both these lines are selected and hit Alt and click. That'll just add a pipe router, keep things a little bit tidy, so I can bring these over here. So now it's being stabilized over here and then unstabilized over here, which seems kind of pointless. But now, if I add something between these two nodes, like a text for example, just type something random, and I press play, it follows the motion of the head. Now for just one thing, that seems like a lot of work. But if we add a bunch of different things, and as long as they're between these trackers, they're gonna have the right movement. So that's just gonna make life so much easier. I can get rid of those. So we wanna add a skull right here, but this guy's big ol' helmet's in the way. So let's get rid of that. Now ideally you would shoot a clean plate for something like this, but since I'm working with stock footage, I don't have that luxury. So I intentionally cut my footage so that nothing passes behind his head, so all I have to worry about is the sky, and the sky is really just a gradient. So I can bring down a background node, change the type to gradient, and set the start point somewhere above his head, and the end point right below it. So with the black point selected, I can take this color picker and then choose the area of sky closest to that point, and do the same with the white point. Now I can merge that over our footage, and now it's covering everything. That's not very useful. So with the background selected, I'm gonna add a polygon tool, and then very roughly make a shape around his head. And then make sure to soft edge that. Then I'm gonna add another polygon and set the paint mode to subtract. You might wanna disconnect the background from the merge at this point. So now I'm gonna make a tighter mask going around his shoulders. And then when I get to the part where his head would be, just kinda guess where that would be. So it's only the shoulders I'm really focusing on. I don't have to be as tight with anywhere else. All right, now I can reconnect that to the merge and soft edge that a little tiny bit. Now I'm gonna scrub through my shot to make sure that it roughly follows the shape of his shoulders. Now it looks like his head is being removed from the shot. It's a little bit rough. You can technically still see the helmet here, but since it's a really similar color to the jacket, I don't think it's gonna be that noticeable. Again, we're gonna be adding a skull and fire a lot of things that are gonna draw the eye, so any mistakes aren't really gonna be that noticeable. Now if you're doing a shot like this where you need to see through the neck hole, just mask out around the neck hole, then take a picture of the back of the shirt and put that behind it. So now let's add our skull. So the skull model I'm using came from Paint 3D. It's a free program that lets you download tons of free 3D models. I just made a whole video where I go into detail on how to download those models and use them in Fusion, and you can check that out right here. So for now, I'm just going to go to Fusion, import Alembic Scene, then find my skull, hit OK. I can drag that up here, bring that to the viewer. I can click on this to turn on lighting. So I'm also going to add a camera 3D and a render 3D. And then I'm gonna take the renderer and merge that over our footage, bring that to the viewer. I think I'm also gonna open the dual viewer and bring the merge 3D into that. Then I'm gonna add a transform 3D before the merge and just use that to position the skull into place. It might help to disable the merge that's cutting out the head. It also helps to add a directional light into the merge 3D. Then in the render, enable lighting. That just helps you see the shape of the skull a bit more. And then in the merge, I'm gonna bring down the blend so I can see my footage behind the skull. Now I'm just gonna position this so it matches with my footage. Then I'm gonna put a keyframe on the X, Y, and Z rotation, and then just scrub through my footage, making sure that it roughly matches the rotation of my head. Now I can bring the blend back up to 1 and re-enable that merge. So now I'm gonna bring in the textures for my skull. So I have them in the media pool right here. So I have a color map and a roughness map. So after the color map, I'm gonna add a blend and plug that into the mesh. Then I'm gonna take the output of the roughness map and plug it into this pink arrow right here. Then I'm gonna take the directional light and rotate it so that it matches where the light's coming from in my footage. And to make it match the color, I can take this color picker right here and then choose a color from my sky. Now since it's a pretty cloudy day, I'm gonna go into my blend under the specular and then just play around with the exponent. If the lighting's not looking quite right, you can copy and paste the directional light and plug that into the merge, then move that to the side and play around with the rotation of that one. Maybe bring down the intensity a little bit. Now to fill in some of these shadows, I'm also going to add an ambient light, plug that into the merge 3D, and again, color pick of color from my sky. Now in the renderer, under the output channels, I can check Z and vector. Then in the image tab, I can bring down the depth to float 16. Now I'm gonna add some ambient occlusion. I'm gonna add the ambient occlusion node, plug my camera into that, change the kernel type to sphere, and just bring down the kernel radius until we start seeing some shadows in the crevices right there. Then I'm gonna change the output mode to color again. Then I'm gonna add some motion blur using the vector motion blur node. So to make it match my footage, I'm also going to add a blur node and bring down the size to about 0.5 looks good for this footage. Now the skull is darker than anything else in my footage, so an easy way to fix that is with a plugin called Match Tint. I really love it. You can get it for free on Reactor. It works basically like the tint effect in After Effects. So I'm gonna add the Match Tint effect, scroll down and hit pre-divide post multiply. Then I'm gonna bring this verge to the right viewer. Then with the matte black, I can take this little eyedropper and then choose a place that's black in our scene and do the same with the white. And then I can play around with the amount to tint to see how strong I want it. Now it still doesn't quite blend with our footage, so to match the colors even better, I can add a color curves node. Now I wanna make sure that I do this before the match tint, so nothing we do is gonna mess with our black point. So I'm gonna click on the viewer and hit R, so now I'm only seeing the red channel. So in this, I can uncheck everything except the red channel, then I can click on this line to add a point, then I can just play around with it until it looks like it matches it a little bit better. Then I can do the same thing in the green and blue channels, hitting G to see the green channel and B to see the blue channel, and then make sure I have the right box checked inside the color curves. Then you can hit C to bring it back to normal, and then make any adjustments you need to from there. This is an easy way to pretty accurately match the colors of your scene. If I turn this on and off, you can see what it's doing. Now let's add some fire. So we're gonna make the fire using particles. Now I've played around with making fire with particles in the past and it's always looked pretty fake, but this way actually looks pretty realistic. So to start, I'm gonna bring down a P emitter and a P renderer. Bring that to the viewer. So the secret to getting really realistic fire is to use actual fire as the texture of the particles. So in the media pool, I'm gonna bring down this fire asset that I downloaded from ProductionCrate.com. They have a ton of really high quality fire assets and a lot of them are free, so I'll link this one down in the description. So in the P emitter, I'm gonna go to style, change the style to bitmap, and then plug our fire into that. So if I press play, all the fireballs are happening at the exact same time, which is not what we want. So I'm gonna take the animate and set it to particle age. That's looking better, but they're all really small. So under the size, I'm gonna bring the size all the way up to 1. Now you might notice there's this weird black halo around them. So to fix that, I can right click, go to transparency, and change that to quicksort. Now that looks better. Now under the controls, I'm gonna take the number, bring that down to 1, and bring the number variance up to 2. So to give it some motion, I'm gonna add a P turbulence, and bring the X, Y, and Z strength all to 0.5, and bring up the density a little bit. Now it's looking pretty good, but I don't want the fire building up at the beginning. I want it to be already going when the shot starts. So it takes about 30 frames for it to get to full force. So in the P render, I'm gonna go under pre-generate frames and set that to 30. So now it'll skip over those first 30 frames and just get to where the fire is at its hottest. So now I wanna make sure that it's coming from the skull. So I'm gonna bring just the skull to the viewer and select the P emitter. So now I can see the P emitter in this viewer for the skull. So I'm just gonna position it so it starts in the middle of the skull's head. Then under the region, I'm gonna bring up the size so that it fills it up. I can also copy the transform from the skull and paste that after the P render, so now it has the same motion of the head. I'm also gonna make a copy of the camera 3D, paste that over here, and merge that over the transform 3D. In this left viewer, I'm gonna right click on the perspective, change that to camera 3D 1. I can turn off the lighting, I don't need that. So now I'm gonna zoom out, drag out from my footage and plug that into the camera 3D 1. So now I can see my footage behind the fire. So since he's riding pretty fast, the fire should be billowing in the wind. So to add that, I can add a P directional force. Now by default, it's gonna go down. So I'm gonna change the direction to 0, and then change the direction Z to -90. I want it to be moving faster, so I'm gonna take the strength and bring that to 0.5. So now I can take the direction and play around with it until it looks right. Now since it's moving so fast, we're starting to see gaps between the particles. So to fix that, under the P emitter, under the controls, we can bring the number up to 2. Now I can disconnect the footage from the camera, we don't need that anymore, and add a render 3D. Under the output channels, I can enable vector. So we want this fire to be wrapping around the skull, and we can do that using a depth path from our skull. So how do we get that? So first, in the skull renderer, under the controls and the output channels, we can check world position. Then I'm gonna add a channel booleans. Make sure you're doing channel booleans with an S, not channel boolean. They're not the same thing. So I'm gonna add that, and plug the render into that, aim at the viewer. Then under the alpha, I can bring down this drop down and change the alpha to Z position foreground. So now if I hover my mouse over that, at the bottom, you can see the alpha values are the same as the Z values. But alpha values usually work between 0 and 1. So to get this to a point where it's usable, I can add a brightness contrast and uncheck all of these boxes and then check A. So this is only going to affect the alpha channel. So hovering over this with my mouse, I'm getting values of around -7. So I'm going to take the low and put it at -7. Now I can pull up from my render 3D, plug this into the mask input. Now I can press A to see the alpha channel and bring down my high slider until I start seeing the front of my head. Now I can plug this into the mask input of the render 3D, then in the settings, I can check apply mask inverted. Now I can bring down the high slider until it starts looking right. So now if I click and drag between these 2 points, I can choose how far up the fire will go in front of the face. Now I'm going to add a vector motion blur after this, and merge this over the footage. Now I can change the apply mode to screen. Now it looks a little bit weak, so I'm going to add some glow. So I'm going to be using X-Glow, which is another plugin you can get on Reactor, but you can also use the soft glow. So by default, the X-Glow is going to be way too bright, so I can bring up the threshold sliders until just the bright parts are glowing. Now this fire is way more saturated than anything else in the scene, so I'm going to add a brightness contrast after the glow and bring down the saturation to about 0.5. Again, this is just for my footage, tweak it until it matches yours. Now the fire should be casting a light on the skull. So before the skulls transform, I'm going to add a merge 3D, bring that to the viewer, and make sure to check pass through lights. Then I'm going to bring down a spotlight, drag that into the merge. Then I'm going to drag it out behind the head. Then in the transform settings, I'm going to check use target and bring it up somewhere around the middle of the head. Now I can play around and position it so that the light is bleeding over the edge. Then in the controls, I can bring down this color thing and change it to a nice yellowish orange color. Then bring up the cone angle and the penumbra angle all the way. And if it's not looking bright enough for you, you can bring up the intensity to something like 1.5. Now because we added everything between these trackers, at the end, everything has the correct motion. Finally, to get rid of the edges problem, I can add a brightness contrast after my last tracker, then copy and paste my original footage, plug that into the mask of that, then the settings, check multiply by mask. Now if you want the skull to automatically follow the motion of your face, then you're going to need to motion track that, and I show you how to do that in this video right here.